She had nothing but a borrowed coat and a baby who would not stop crying. He had a fire going. The baby had been crying for 2 hours. Not the fussy, intermittent crying of a child who wants attention, but the relentless, gasping, full-throated wail of a baby who is cold and hungry, and 6 weeks old, and operating on the only communication system available, which is volume. The baby's name was Rosalie, though she was too young to know it, and her mother's name was Sable Greer, though Sable was too exhausted to remember much beyond the next step, the next breath, the next attempt to quiet a child who could not be quieted, because the things she needed, warmth, food, shelter, were things her mother could not provide. Sable was walking. She had been walking since morning, which was 9 hours ago, down a road in eastern Oregon that went through country that was beautiful in the way that indifferent things are beautiful, grand and cold and unconcerned with the woman and the baby moving through it. She was 22. She was wearing a coat that belonged to the woman at the last farmhouse, who had given it to her with a piece of bread and a look of pity that Sable had accepted along with the coat, because pride was a luxury and the coat was a necessity. Beneath the coat, she wore a dress that had been washed so many times the pattern was a memory. And beneath the dress, she wore the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been carrying a baby and walking for 9 hours on a piece of bread and no plan. She had come from a town called Delwood, where she had been living with her husband's family since her husband died. Her husband Everett had died of typhoid in August, 3 weeks before Rosalie was born, and his family, his mother and his brother, had tolerated Sable for exactly as long as it took for the baby to arrive and begin the business of being a baby, which involves noise and expense and attention. And then they had made it clear, in the polite but unmistakable language of people who have decided that a mouth they did not choose to feed is a mouth they do not intend to keep feeding, that Sable and the baby should find somewhere else to be. She had no family of her own. She had no family and no savings and no inheritance and no connections, nothing that a woman in the territory could use as a foundation for an independent life. Her parents had died when she was 16, her father in a logging accident, her mother of grief that the doctor called pneumonia, but that everyone who knew her called heartbreak, and she had been on her own since, working as a cook and a laundress and a seamstress and whatever else a 16-year-old girl with no family and no education and no money could find to do in a territory that offered women few options and orphaned women fewer. She married Everett Greer because he was kind, and because kindness, when you have experienced enough of its absence, is the most compelling quality a person can possess. He was not ambitious or wealthy or especially clever. He worked at the sawmill in Delwood and came home each evening smelling of pine sap and sawdust. But he was kind, and the kindness was real, and the marriage was good for the 2 years it lasted. And then the typhoid came, and the kindness ended, and the marriage ended, and everything ended except Sable and the baby, who continued, because continuing is what the living do even when the reasons for continuing are hard to identify. The road went through a valley that narrowed between ridges of pine and basalt, and at the narrowest point, the road crossed a creek on a wooden bridge, and beyond the bridge was a house. Not a grand house, a cabin really, with a stone chimney and a cedar shake roof, and a porch that sagged on one end, and a barn that was larger than the house, which suggested that the occupant valued his animals at least as much as himself. Smoke came from the chimney, rising straight in the still evening air, like a signal meant for no one in particular. Light came from the window, yellow and steady, the light of a kerosene lamp in a room where someone was home. Both of these things, smoke and light, communicated the same message to a woman who had neither, and the message was warmth. Sable stopped at the gate. She stood in the road with the baby crying against her chest and the borrowed coat pulled tight and her body shaking from cold and exhaustion and the particular desperation of a person who has arrived at a stranger's gate and must decide whether the risk of asking for help is greater than the risk of continuing without it. She knocked on the door. She knocked with a hand that was numb from the cold and shaking from exhaustion, and that produced a knock so faint she was not sure it could be heard inside. She knocked again, harder, and the door opened, letting out a rectangle of warmth and light, and the man behind it looked at her. His name was Fletcher Pine. He was 39, a bachelor, a horse breeder who raised draft horses on 160 acres of valley land that was better suited to horses than to the man raising them, because the land was generous and the man was solitary. He was tall, with the thick arms and the sloped shoulders of a man who spends his days lifting hay and grain and harness and foals, and he had a face that was more weathered than aged, carved by wind and sun into an expression of permanent vigilance, the face of a man who watches horizons. He looked at Sable. He looked at the baby. He looked at the borrowed coat and the dress beneath it, and the shoes that were not shoes anymore, but leather, held together by determination and stitching. "Come inside," he said. He did not ask her name. He did not ask for an explanation or a justification or any of the questions that a reasonable man might ask before inviting a stranger into his home. He did not ask where she had come from or where she was going or why she was standing at his gate with a crying baby at dusk in October. He opened the door wider and stepped aside. And the warmth of the house, the fire in the stone fireplace, the heat that had accumulated in the log walls, and the wooden floor and the air itself, hit Sable like a physical thing, a wall of warmth that her cold body walked into and was immediately surrounded by. The fire was going. That was the thing she would remember later, when she told the story. Not the house or the man or the door, but the fire. It was a real fire, built with intention, the kind of fire that a man builds at the end of a working day for the specific purpose of warmth, with a base of hardwood coals and a crown of pine that burned with the clean, bright heat that only dry pine produces. The fire was everything she needed, and everything the baby needed, and everything the world had not provided for 9 hours. And it was going, and the going was an act of grace that Fletcher Pine had performed without knowing he was performing it. She sat by the fire. She sat in a chair that Fletcher pulled close to the hearth, and she opened the borrowed coat and held Rosalie against her skin, and the baby's crying began to ease. Slowly at first, the wails spacing out like waves losing their urgency, and then faster, the crying diminishing into whimpers, and the whimpers diminishing into the small wet sounds of a baby who has been cold and is becoming warm and is deciding, with the wisdom of 6 weeks, that warmth is acceptable. Fletcher moved around the kitchen. He moved with the particular quiet of large men in small spaces, conscious of the noise his body could make and choosing not to make it. He heated milk in a pot on the stove. He cut bread from a loaf that was 2 days old but still edible. He found a blanket from the chest in the bedroom, a wool blanket, heavy, the kind that a man who lives alone keeps for the worst nights of winter. He brought the milk, which was warm, and the bread, which he had sliced thick, and the blanket, which smelled of cedar and clean wool, to Sable, without ceremony. He set them on the table beside her chair and stepped back, giving her the space that a person needs when they are at the lowest point of their resources, and the last thing they need is someone standing over them expecting gratitude. Sable drank the milk. She ate the bread. She wrapped Rosalie in the wool blanket and held her against her chest and felt the baby's breathing slow and deepen and become the breathing of sleep, which is the most peaceful sound in the world and which Sable had not heard in 2 hours. "Thank you," she said. The words were inadequate and she knew it, but they were the words she had, and she used them. "You can stay the night," Fletcher said. "The bedroom is through that door. I will sleep in the barn. I cannot take your bedroom." It is not about taking. It is about the baby needing a warm room with a door that shuts, and the bedroom is the warmest room, and the door shuts. I have slept in the barn before. The horses do not mind. Sable slept. She slept in Fletcher Pine's bed with Rosalie beside her, and the wool blanket over both of them, and the fire in the next room casting light under the door. And she slept the sleep of a person who has walked 9 hours and carried a baby and arrived at a place where the arriving meant something, and the something was safety. She stayed 1 night, then 2, then a week. The staying happened the way most important things happen, incrementally, without a formal decision, through the accumulation of small necessities that became larger necessities, that became a pattern that neither of them could imagine breaking without loss. Fletcher gave her the bedroom. He moved his things to the barn, which he had insulated the previous winter for the horses, and which was, he claimed, perfectly comfortable for a man who did not require comfort. He went about his work with the horses, feeding before dawn, training in the long mornings, grooming in the afternoons, repairing fences and harness, and shoes and stalls, and the 100 daily tasks that a horse breeding operation demands. And he came home each evening to a house that was different from the house he had left that morning, because Sable was in it. She cleaned, she cooked, she washed clothes and mended socks, and organized the kitchen, which had been organized by a bachelor, and therefore had not been organized at all. The flour was next to the horse liniment, the coffee was behind the nails, and the salt was in 3 different containers, in 3 different locations, none of which were convenient. She did these things not out of obligation, but out of the need to contribute, to earn the warmth and the bed, and the milk and the bread, to convert her presence from burden to value, in the accounting system that desperation imposes on people who have nothing, and must justify the space they occupy. Fletcher did not keep accounts. He did not calculate the cost of her presence, or weigh it against the benefit of her labor. He simply adjusted his life to include 2 additional people, the way a river adjusts its course, to include a new tributary, naturally, without resistance, as though the tributary had always been there, and the river had been waiting for it. The baby grew. Rosalie gained weight and volume, and the particular rosy health that warm rooms and regular meals produce in infants, and the crying that had been relentless on the road, became the ordinary intermittent crying of a baby who has needs, and has learned that the needs will be met, and can therefore afford to be patient between the needing and the meeting. Fletcher held her. He held Rosalie for the first time on the 3rd evening, when Sable needed both hands to cook supper, and the baby needed holding, and the solution was obvious, even to a man who had never held a baby. He held her with the careful, exaggerated gentleness of a man who handles draft foals with 1 hand, and is now holding something far smaller and far more breakable with 2. And the baby looked up at him with the blue, unfocused eyes of the newly alive, and grabbed his finger and held on. And the holding on was so firm and so total that Fletcher felt something shift inside his chest. A rearrangement of priorities that was immediate and permanent, and that had nothing to do with logic, and everything to do with a small hand wrapped around his finger. Sable watched. She watched from the stove, where she was stirring stew, and she saw the expression on Fletcher Pine's face change from careful concentration to something else, something softer, something more vulnerable, something that a man who watches horizons does not usually allow to cross his features, but that a baby's grip can produce in anyone, regardless of how solitary or guarded they believe themselves to be. "She likes you," Sable said. "She has poor judgment. She is 6 weeks old. Her judgment is fine. Babies know. What do they know? They know who is safe." The winter came. It came with snow and wind and the particular cold that eastern Oregon produces when the air comes down from the Wallowas. A cold so total that it makes the house feel like a ship, and the world outside like an ocean that is trying to get in. Fletcher kept the fire going. He kept it going all winter, through December and January and February, feeding it with wood he had split in September, and stacked against the barn. And the fire that Sable had walked toward on that October evening became the fire that carried all 3 of them through the winter, a constant in a house where everything else was changing. 2 strangers becoming companions, companions becoming partners, partners becoming something that neither of them named out loud, until the silence between them became so full of it that the naming was redundant. They married in March, on a Saturday when the snow was melting and the creek was running high and the horses were shedding their winter coats in handfuls. The ceremony was at the house, performed by the circuit preacher who came through the valley every 6 weeks, and Rosalie attended from Fletcher's arms, which had become her preferred location, and from which she observed the proceedings with the calm authority of a baby who has decided that the world is acceptable and the large man holding her is permanent. The woman with the borrowed coat and the man with the fire built a life in the valley that neither of them had planned, and both of them had needed. The coat was returned to the farmhouse woman, with a letter of thanks and a jar of honey from the hives that Fletcher kept at the edge of the orchard. The fire never went out. Fletcher kept it going through every winter that followed, and Sable sat beside it on cold evenings with Rosalie in her lap and the wool blanket over her knees, and the warmth that had saved her life on an October evening became the warmth that defined it.